Today I want to talk about one of the most baffling, weird divisions that I see in literature, and one of the most basic ones as well, which is the weird cleavage between fiction and nonfiction. And I find it baffling because sometimes I speak to people who are like, nope, I don't read fiction, or nope, I wouldn't even open a nonfiction book. And to me, that is one of the most fundamental elements of reading a little bit eclectically and outside of your comfort zone and pushing yourself to discover new things. So I'm always a little bit weirded out by when I hear people be that dogmatic about one or the other. And so today I kind of want to try and convince both sides, whether you're a never fictioner or a never non-fictioner. I want to try and raise some ideas and arguments for both camps to maybe convince you to broaden your horizons a little bit and help you understand why it's so enriching to read across both sides of the aisle. So for those of you who only read nonfiction and never read fiction, and I feel that's like the bigger camp. I encounter a lot of people who tell me like, I only read nonfiction. I would never touch a novel because I'm not going to learn anything from it. I find that extremely strange. And if we have that conversation together, I'll generally be more polite about it and I'll be like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Maybe I can convince you with a great novel. But in reality, I'm thinking like, this is super weird. Here's what I think. I get the appeal of people who only want to read nonfiction, and there's a very direct appeal there. You think that by reading nonfiction, you are focusing your reading on learning real world facts, real world ideas, subjects, and that you're learning. And that novels are maybe something of a fantasy that have little real world applications, that it's not really relevant to the real world. And so what's the point of reading a novel? You're not learning anything. And so I get that. But I would say to you, if that is the kind of reader that you are really limiting yourself. And I'm going to hazard a guess, and it's really a broadly stereotypical guess, but I would say the people who only read nonfiction are generally the people who are in big jobs, big careers, probably in business or finance, and they need to learn the next big idea, and they see reading as a tool, as a useful tool and application to learn new things that are going to further them professionally. Okay, great. I think that's wonderful, and I think it's very commendable to read in order to learn. But what you're missing out on if you're only reading nonfiction and you're skipping fiction is an entire other element of human knowledge and human emotion that is also critical for a professional setting, for management dynamics. You're missing out on a whole other point. So let me start by saying, for example, there's a great book by a Yale academic called Harold Bloom, who's since then been a bit disgraced by Me Too, and he's not in everyone's best books. But he came up with an interesting theory back in the mid-90s. He was a Shakespeare scholar at Yale, and he came up with this interesting theory that, in fact, Shakespeare had, quote unquote, invented the human. Now, probably more modern research has invalidated it, and the fact that he's been Me Too'd and a bit canceled has invalidated him and his thinking and so on. But let me just dwell on this maybe archaic idea that Shakespeare had invented the human, that this playwright in the Elizabethan era had come up with some fundamental psychological human traits of how we as a species react in certain circumstances. If we've been duped by our mother who's married our uncle, like in Hamlet, we might react in a certain way. If we are in love with a fellow teenager and our parents don't want us to be together, we might react in a certain way, like Romeo and Juliet did. So there's a lot of different ways that Shakespeare kind of interpreted human situations and the corresponding human emotions and wrote a template for human emotion. And I think if you look at that idea and you then extrapolate it, you can then say, well, all novelists, anybody who's written fiction, has in a larger or smaller way created a modularity, an element of human emotion, has contributed to a quote-unquote case study of human emotion and how we humans react. And the greatest novelists of all time, and here I'm talking guys like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Dickens, Flaubert, Cormac McCarthy, to name only dead white guys, unfortunately, are people who really were able to create certain emotions out of certain situations, who were able to build moral architecture around their characters, were able to build these ethical dilemmas where certain human reactions feel incredibly real and can be seen as a template for one's moral or ethical behavior or emotional responses. And I think you become a little bit more human by reading these kind of stories. You understand better what it is to be human, and it grows your EQ, your emotional quotient, your emotional intelligence. And I think if I read a lot of nonfiction literature around what it takes to be a great manager, a great leader, EQ is a bit of a buzzword these days. And you know, it's great to be academically smart and know a lot of facts and a lot of knowledge and so on. But if you're not able to have some emotional responses to the people around you, to the situations around you and so on, you're not going to do as well in your professional setting as you might otherwise. So it's for that reason that I would encourage anybody who's totally obsessed and focused on strategy books and business biographies and so on, who want to learn the facts and the ideas and so on. It's for that reason that I would encourage you to boost up and dope up your emotional quotient by reading these really intense moral and emotional stories that the best authors in the world have put together in these, fictionalized, maybe a bit La La Land settings, but that hit you emotionally and build your emotional muscle and help you in your managerial skills and so on. So that's one side of the equation. And I also think that it helps you to develop some lateral thinking and helps you to see things in different dimensions that you might not see if you just stick to kind of business strategies, how to grow your business, how to get traction in your business, and how to read the biography of a guy who got traction in the business. If you're able to develop that muscle of fiction, I think you'll find yourself thinking a little bit outside the box. And that's not just an emotional response, but also an intellectual response to fiction, and one that I think is really very useful. So if ever you are an only nonfiction reader and you're like, okay, I'm convinced I would like to read more fiction, but I don't know where to start, then, send me a note in the comments or whatever, or contact me by Instagram, DM me on Instagram or whatever, and I'd be happy to recommend you some fiction that'll get you thinking a little bit differently and a little bit more emotionally. Then there's the other side of the coin. There are people who only read novels and are a bit contrarian about fiction And, those are the more poetic souls in life who are like, oh, I just want to be transported. I read to be transported. I read to travel and be taken to new worlds and develop my imagination. All of which are, by the way, great arguments that I should have probably mentioned for people who only read nonfiction. But so people who only read fiction, their arguments tend to be like, I want to be transported. I don't want to be stuck in the real world. I want to have different thought processes. I want to escape, right? Great. That's wonderful. I would say nonfiction brings a whole lot of learning as well, and can transport you in amazing places as well, even if it is fundamentally anchored in reality. There are a lot of nonfiction books, let's say biographies or autobiographies, that have specifically adopted the codes of fiction because they recognize that telling the story in a quite lateral way, in a way that's a little bit emotional, is more engaging for the reader. And so you do get books that are written in these very engaging fictionalized ways. So for example, if I take the biographies of Robert Caro, who wrote biographies of Lyndon Johnson and Robert Moses, which for me are like the highest quality biographies ever written in history. Those books read like novels. That's as good as Dickens is ever going to get. It's as good as Dostoevsky's ever going to get. Those books are golden stories. And you then think to yourself, wow, this is true. And this is even stranger than fiction. Like, I cannot believe this story is true. So you've got that element there. But I also think that reading more nonfiction, it helps you engage with the real world that we live in, whether you're reading history or political theory or a biography or anything else, sociology, what have you. It helps bring you to a place where thought and reason are prevailing as opposed to relying too heavily on emotion and faith. So you want to kind of balance all of those. You don't want to be just about reason and growing your career and so on. And you don't just want to be about transportation into other worlds. You want to go back and forth. You want to explore the different codes. And I think it'll make you a better reader. I love using gym analogies because actually reading and going to the gym are very similar. And so if you were going to the gym, you wouldn't do just like arm day every day. That would just be weird. You'd have huge arms, but like skinny little legs, and the rest of your strength and core wouldn't be all that good. You want to mix it up. You want to tell your reading muscles, different muscles are being used, different parts of your mind are being used, different parts of your soul are being connected to. And so that is really very interesting. So again, if you're somebody who only reads fiction and you're like, you know what, I'm convinced I could read a little bit more nonfiction, I should get into it, but you need some inspiration for that, don't hesitate to comment or DM me on Instagram and I'll sort you out. I'll lead you on a path of finding some great nonfiction that'll read like a book of fiction that transports you into a different world. So that's my advice. I would urge everyone to bridge the aisle. If you're a reader of only one kind of books, try and go outside your comfort zone just once or twice, just to go visit the other side of the fence and see what it's like. And again, if you need any advice on how to best go across the other side, DM me, and I'm always available to share some thoughts on what might help you. I'd love to hear from any of you if you are only fiction readers or only nonfiction readers, or how you got from one side of the fence to the other. Be great to get some insights into what motivates people to go back and forth. Let me know in the comments. Always open for discussion. In the meantime, keep reading. Thanks a lot. Bye.